I've been mentioning, in a limited manner, the importance of developing your pieces as quickly as you can. The reason for this is self-evident. If you only have 2 pieces in play, while your opponent has 5, the battle probably won't go well for you. However, there's an old saying that makes us do a bit of a double take. No development is better than a bad development. That sounds like it could be profound, but what in the world does it mean? And what's a bad development? To answer this, we need to revisit one of the most important things in this course. Pawns are the soul of chess, and the pawn skeleton is the framework of everything your position is and can be. In short, the pawn skeleton tells you what you should be doing. And following this train of thought, it also tells you where your pieces should be placed so that they can make the pawn skeleton's dictate a reality. Think of it this way. A large company needs a building that will serve its specific needs. An architect is hired to design and oversee the project. Though he often is given creative license to create something really cool, he can't forget that everything he does has to cater to the building's purpose. So he creates a blueprint that shows every detail of this construction. Workers are hired to build it. And hopefully, the ultimate result will not only serve the company's needs, but also highlight the architect's creative skills. The pawn skeleton is the company who dictates what it wants and needs. The pieces are the workers that get the job done, and you are the architect that follows the pawn skeleton's needs. Make sure that the pieces follow your blueprint and ultimately stamps your own creativity to the overall project. Now we can return to no development is better than a bad development. If you get your pieces out, but their positioning has nothing to do with the pawn skeleton's wishes, you'll find that a skilled player who is following the position's blueprint will walk right over you because his pieces are working together for one unified purpose, while your pieces aren't. So please, do get your pieces out as quickly as possible, but make sure you have asked the pawn skeleton what it wants first. Of course, I don't expect you to mine the pawn structure's hidden secrets right away, but even a glimpse at what it wants will help you bring your pieces to reasonable squares. Here's a simple example of one side, white, trying to follow the pawn structure's bidding, and the other side ignoring the structure for whatever adventure caught his eye. d4, knight f6, c4, e5. The Budapest Gambit. It's not a bad opening. It strives to open up the position and get easy, free play for black's pieces. Note that the f8 bishop is suddenly eyeing this whole diagonal, and, it's actually very, very playable. Knight g4 and bishop f4. White understands that black will eventually get a sacrifice pawn back, but white wants him to have to fight for it, at least a little bit, meaning that black has to waste time to regain material parity. If the only point of this move was to defend the pawn, it wouldn't be particularly good. But it also develops a piece on a good central square and intends to follow up with knight c3, which works with the c4 pawn in putting pressure on the important d5 square. In general, white's not striving for too much. He wants to consolidate his central space advantage, thanks to this c4 pawn, and develop the rest of his army towards the center. Since the d-file is half open, once white develops and castles, a white rook will make its way to d1, claiming the file and aiming yet another piece at d5. g5. Very, very aggressive. But it doesn't develop a piece, and it severely weakens black's kingside pawn structure. More popular is knight c6, simply trying to get this pawn back. Bishop to d2. Bishop to g7. So black is going to get the pawn back, but he did create those weaknesses. White brings a knight out. He has to finish his development. Always finish your development. And notice that g5 is now threatened. White's bishop and knight hit it, so black takes a moment out to play h6. And white wants to crack that area, so he plays h4. Black finally regains his pawn. We have a trade. And now white takes. And black is thinking, oh, wait a second. Why would he take? Because I'm actually threatening to take this b pawn, which would also win the rook. However, if you look at the position, black has only one piece out, and his king side is dismantled. And so white actually wanted him to do this, and so in a moment of greed, which black will never recover from, he took it off. White just trapped the bishop, so it's kind of stuck and it has to take the rook now. And of course, white also is developing. He took, queen takes. Now, white's down in exchange, but h6 is about to fall, which would make the material disparity nominal at best. But the real story here is that white now has 4 pieces in play, and here they are. The rook is on an open file right now. The bishop's developed, the knight's developed, and this queen is out. So white has 4 pieces in play, while black's pieces are all at home taking a siesta. The final death blow is that black's dark squares are owned by white. Notice how white's queen is just breathing fire down this long diagonal. The d2 bishop controls the c1 to h6 diagonal. And I just showed you how the queen is really breathing fire down that other diagonal. Finally, at any moment, the knight can leap into d5, and all these dark squared weaknesses are going to just ravage black. The fact is that black can resign right now. He played h5, so I couldn't take that pawn. Knight to d5. Now we simply threaten queen takes rook mate. So the rook moves away. Queen e5 check, and he resigned. The only move he has is queen e7, and that's checkmate. What happened? Black played on the wing instead of the center. This is fine if the center is blocked by pawns. That's known as a closed position. If the center is open, then you have to challenge the opponent and insist you get a bit of that central territory. Black created weaknesses in his own king side. In fact, the whole a1, h8 diagonal was weakened beyond repair, and ultimately it was used as a road to black's king. And he fell way behind in development. This is sometimes acceptable if the position is closed, since then it's very hard for one side to burst through due to both sides' pawns blocking diagonals and files. But if the position is wide open, then a lack of development is often fatal. We just saw what can happen to the side that doesn't develop in an open position. Now let's take a look at a closed position and how it can stem the enemy hordes. White has developed everything, while black is only 2 knights out. Yet, black is fine, since the pawn center is blocking all of white's pieces. White's queen and rooks are hitting a wall, with white's own center pawns being the culprit. The c3 knight can't move to b5 or d5 or e4. All those are covered. White's f2 bishop is blocked by his own pawn. White's light-squared bishop is hitting granite on d5, while the e4 square is a no-man's zone. If white tries bishop g4, queen a5, bishop takes, g takes, it's still very comfortable for black because all of white's pieces are still completely blocked. Now let's compare the black's okay position with the following example. This is the same position we just looked at, with the one difference being that the 4 center pawns have been removed. Suddenly, we have an open position, and all of white's pieces are streaming down the center, while black's undeveloped army and a central king guarantees that black won't escape this position alive. Rook f1 check, bishop e7, knight e4. Notice that if black castles, he just loses a piece. And you don't want to lose a piece. You don't have any chance then. So he tries to castle queenside. Queen c7. Queen takes d7 check, and we use the pin knight f6 check. The bishop cannot take that knight because of the pin along the e file. King f8, knight takes d7 check, and white's a knight ahead, and black would resign. Clearly, an open position and closed position are vastly different animals, and what works in one of them won't always work in the other. And of course, the thing that tells us whether a position is open or closed is the pawn skeleton. An open center gives the pieces more diagonals and files earlier in the game. A closed center, though, calls for more maneuvering, with the diagonals and files appearing a bit later in the game. Let's take a look at a well-known closed pawn structure. This particular skeleton has a lot to say. A glance will tell you that neither side's pieces, and you'll have to imagine many pieces on the board, this structure example is just a skeleton, will be able to charge down the center and enter the enemy position. Due to this, both sides need to use kingside and queenside pawn advances to create new files and diagonals, thereby planting the seeds that eventually will lead to active pieces on the wing. Let's see how a real game with this same central skeleton might play out. Both armies are blocked in the center, but if there aren't any diagonals for your bishops or files for your rooks, you can't just sit around and moan about your bad luck. Instead, you have to find a way to create those things. Since the center is, at the moment, an impenetrable wall, the only way to open files and diagonals and free your pieces is to advance your pawns on the wings, create contact with enemy pawns, and initiate pawn captures. This will result in the needed open lines. White can play, for example, a4 to a5 and capture and open some lines this way. Or he can push his b pawn to b4 and open some lines that way. On the other side of the board, on the king side, white, if he decided to play over here, could play for g4 and eventually g5 and open a file in this manner. Of course, the advance of your g-pawn opens lines on the same side as your king, so you need to be a little aware of possible repercussions if you choose a kingside pawn advance. Black can open lines on the queen side by b6 to b5, but his king is there, so the idea is extremely dangerous. Breaking on the other side makes more sense, so something like g7 to g6 followed by capturing on f5 opens the g file. At the moment, white has more kingside space thanks to his f5 pawn. And his dark squared bishop enjoys a certain measure of activity along these two diagonals. Black's dark squared bishop is his only active piece since it somehow managed to get outside the pawn chain, thus avoiding the central block that is stifling the other pieces. Since the bishop on d4 is active, white decides to capture it with his inactive knight. So he snaps it off, and black is faced with two choices. Should he take it with the c-pawn or the e-pawn? He took it with the e-pawn, which was a blunder. He really had to take the other way, and it would just be a game. Now, though, something terrible has happened. Before, if we look at this position a moment ago, look at white's h3 knight. It can't move to g5. It can't move to f4. It's not going to be doing anything for a long, long time. However, now, after this capture, the knight suddenly leaps into f4 because black has moved that pawn away and given that square to white. But even worse, After black makes another move, the knight continues forward and leaps into e6, which is a nightmare, no pun intended. So a knight on the 6th rank is incredibly powerful. And suddenly the tide turns in favor of white. The rook moves to safety, and white now rips open files on the queen side to go after black's king. We have a trade of pawns, and now black truly goes insane. Maybe a little too much absinthe at that time. b5, b takes c5, b takes c4, c6, a brilliant move. And notice everything's happening right in the face of black's king. You don't want that to happen. You don't want all the play happening right in front of your king. And so from a reasonable position to complete grim death, it's a quick jump. c6 wins material by force. You notice that if black were to take white's queen, white would take his queen, and after he takes back, the bishop hangs and white's a piece up. So black tries something a little different. Knight takes c6, but then white saves his queen. He simply takes the c4 pawn, pinning the knight to the king, and he's going to win the piece anyway. Black plays another couple moves. As helpless and sad as it is, white continues the attack. The other rook comes, and look at poor black's king. Everything, 2 files right down its face. White's queen is in there, the knight's there. Not good at all. King b8, and the final death move, rook c7. It's guarded by the knight, and the queen is hanging. Queen takes b7 is going to be made, and black resigned and rushed out of the hall pretending that he never played a game in the first place. Sometimes a knight, especially if it's on the central 6th rank, is so powerful and reaches in so many directions that it's called an octopus. Its tentacles are everywhere in the enemy position, and at times such a piece might prove to be more valuable than a rook. In the previous position, the knight on h3 was able to leap to f4 and then to e6, turning into an octopus. But in this situation, black captured with another pawn, thereby not giving up the f4 square. Because black recaptured on d4 with his c-pawn, which deprived the h3 knight access to f4, the knight doesn't have much of a future since his advanced squares were covered by black's pawns on g5 and f4. Let me put this knight's positioning on e6 into perspective. In general, knights are weakest on the 1st rank. On the 2nd rank, they're purely defensive. On the 3rd rank, they're ready for defense, and they can also leap forward and jump into an attack. On the 4th rank, they're actually a powerful attacking force. On the 5th rank, they dominate much of the board, and they're very strong. The 6th rank means that the knight has reached its apex. The 7th and 8th ranks are not as good unless there's some tactical reason, since if you look at the 6, you have control over all these squares. While if you're on the 7th and 8th, you actually lose squares because the board ends. So it actually becomes diminishing returns. Our previous game between Newman and Hamel went well for white. Let's look at the same basic central structure, but this time we'll root for black. Though white has managed to open the f-file for his rook, his e-pawns are doubled and immobile. And though white owns the half-open f-file, it's pretty much a road to nowhere since his other pieces aren't able to work together and create a serious kingside attack, nor can they penetrate into the enemy position. Though f7 to f5 is often an important move for black in structures of this kind, it would undouble white's e-pawns. So Black decides to go for other thematic pawn advances on the queen side. b5, gaining space and trying to open files for his rooks. White hangs on. Notice that he doesn't want to capture because suddenly he just gives black an open file on the A file. Why give it to him for free? So he holds on with b3. And black puts all his pieces on the queen side. He intends to open up those lines and dominate on that wing. White prepares for that. And now this knight comes into the game and hits e4, forcing white to do a defensive move. The bishop now protects the e4 pawn. a5, a big move. Black intends to push the pawn to a4 and rupture the whole queen side. White continues on the king side. a4. This position is lost for white. There's several reasons. One is that this bishop is known as a bad bishop. It's awful. It's just blocked by all its own pawns. The knight has tremendous flexibility and eventually can just, move anywhere on the board. In the meantime, black is ready to open files by capturing pawns over here, and his rooks are going to penetrate at any moment. So all the play is black's, while white can only sit and wait and hope that he somehow survives and perhaps makes a draw. You've seen that closed structures demand maneuvering and the advances of wing pawns to give you the space, diagonals, and files your pieces need. Open positions, though, have to be looked at in a completely different light. There are two kinds of open positions. One mixes positional ideas and sane build-ups while maintaining the possibility of violence at any moment. The other strips the center pawns away as quickly as possible so diagonals and files give the attacking side chances of a quick knockout. While fans of the first, sane kind of open positions have to pay attention to the pawn skeletons, the knockout artists ignore such niceties, relying on tactics and unrelenting brutality to get the job done. In this case, quick development takes on enormous importance. e4, e5, d4, takes, takes, takes. And what's happened is this is all about speed and hurry and open files. And this type of open position is basically just based on rapid development and aggression. Bishop b4 check, knight c3. White gets everything out, and now black gets greedy. If it's an open position and you're behind in development, you do not want to get greedy. You're just adding to his development. And now black takes this knight too, and suddenly white has two monster bishops zipping down the board, and black is hopelessly lost already. Queen g5, rook e1 check. The king is already on its way out. f4, chasing the queen away from the main area. Queen takes f4. The rook's hanging. And now the f6 square is very important because we'd like to check, but the queen's guarding it. So white comes out and offers his queen. Unfortunately, queen takes g4 allows bishop to f6 mate. So he tries to do something about that. He goes queen d6, and he gets mated anyway. Bishop check. He has to take it. Mate. Compared to the previous game, which was chaos and speed and development means everything, here we have a calmer scenario. In this position, strategy rules. There's a lot of subtle stuff going on here. White has the better pawn structure, since black's queenside pawns are doubled, while white's are healthy. On the other hand, black has two bishops, and he hopes to make them as active as possible thanks to the open nature of the pawn structure and the unblocked diagonals that go with it. The e4 pawn gives white a bit more central space, and he has a lead in development. But thanks to the fact that black's pieces and pawns control most of the fifth rank, white isn't in a position to wage immediate war, and black will have enough time to develop his c8 bishop and castle. In a way, instead of white's pieces being blocked by a closed pawn center, they're being blocked by the squares the enemy pawns and pieces control. White needs to develop his b1 knight, and a lot of people would play knight to c3. However, on c3, where is it going? It can't go to b5 or d5. And though it looks pretty on c3, it doesn't have any future. So, most people play knight bd2. Now you can see the knight does have a future. It can come to c4 and hit this bishop. Black develops. White brings another piece into the game. It's very important to get all your pieces into the battle, not just 2 or 3 and then do something. Get everybody into the fight. Knight g6. The knight comes to a very nice square. In fact, the knight is so strong that black gives up one of his bishops to kill it. And the queen calmly gets away from that line of the rook. And black castles on the queen side. And we just have simple development, nothing much going on, and now black plays the pawn to c5, which takes away the d4 square from white's knight, and in general, black is okay. He controls a lot of squares. Even though he has a slightly inferior structure, that structure has some positives too, and all in all, it's considered to be pretty equal. Clearly, those two different scenarios, the maneuvering open center and the rush to kill open center, are vastly different, and you need to be aware of both of them. Central control is critical, with some semi-closed structures using that part of the board to build huge fences, pawn centers that advance forward and overwhelm the opponent, while other central situations have the pawns locked up in the middle, when both sides' pieces will have to desperately seek penetration points on the wings. Open positions can be devoid of intricate central play, instead aiming at wide open lines and quick attacks. But most open positions aren't that one-dimensional, and central control is still the major rallying cry for both sides. However, in those cases where the center isn't blocked by pawn walls, it's blocked by pawns and pieces controlling key squares, as our last example demonstrated. Knights, thanks to their ability to leap over other pieces and pawns, are in their element in closed positions and don't need to have octopus powers to be effective. In the position before us, white has a passed c-pawn, but the knight is blocking it. But that's not the whole story. The knight is actually delighted to be on c6, since it's also attacking b4 and d4, forcing white's queen to babysit both those pawns. It's clear that the knight is a fish in water, happy and useful in a closed scenario. On the other hand, the bishop isn't nearly as useful. Here's the same position, except that I'm taking away the knight and placing a bishop there. Where the knight reveled in its ability to block a pawn and attack things from afar, the bishop is nothing more than a tall pawn. It's stopping white's c-pawn, but in doing so has very little mobility. It's like the little Dutch boy with his finger plugging up the hole in the dike. He's serving a useful purpose, but he's literally trapped on that spot. Note how the knight tied down white's pieces to the defense of b4 and d4, while the bishop can't attack anything at all. Unlike rooks, who can bully almost anything on the chessboard once they find an open file, bishops and knights need lots of tender, loving care. Bishops prize open positions since the pawns are not in their way. Knights, on the other hand, revel in closed positions because they are the only pieces that aren't blocked by the pawns due to their jumping abilities. Many players say they prefer open positions since, in general, it's easier to initiate a quick attack. Others go for closed positions because they like to quietly build up their forces. An attack can follow later when everything is primed. Things can come down to a matter of taste, but in many instances, a player who adores open positions will find himself in a closed one. And a lover of closed positions might discover that he's facing an all-out assault in a wide-open scenario. Whatever your preference, both open and closed positions are going to occur, so you need to understand both.